Hello, this session is on the issue of the Antebellum South and abolitionism. And so, uh, in the first part of the Antebellum South, we talked a lot about the that prior to 1830, that there was an abolitionist impulse, and it was manifested in many different forms. But really, our focus this evening is we want to really look at the antebellum period, beginning from 1830 on, leading up to ultimately the Civil War, the outbreak of the Civil War. But real quick, let's first examine the abolition movement as a reform movement, and it was, first of all, it was tiny. It was a radical, tiny group of people. It was integrated. It had blacks. It consisted of whites. People, and like I said, it was really the abolition movement was a cross section of the U.S. population. It had women, men, people of different ages, and wherever you found slavery, you found abolitionists. So there was abolitionism in the South. There's abolitionism in the West. There's abolitionism in the North. There's abolitionism in the countryside. There's abolitionism in the urban areas. And so abolitionism was everywhere, but also white supremacy was everywhere. White supremacy was everywhere. We tend to, when we think of the racism, we tend to put the microscope and the focus on the lower South. But indeed, there's white supremacy all throughout the country. So that is definitely worth examination as well. Now, the abolition movement of the antebellum period is, without a doubt, one of the most radical social movements in American history. It's a movement in which you're going to see many get killed, but despite the sacrifices, it will be very successful in the end. Who are the abolitionists? I mean, the abolitionists, of course, are largely influenced by this new transcendentalism and romanticism that is really transforming the United States. It's a very important philosophy that has generated a distinctive literary and artistic culture in the United States. Also, the backdrop behind much of the abolitionism is the spiritual movement of the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening really gave power to the idea that one must wage an educational crusade to eradicate sin in American society. And of course, one of the great sins would be the sin of slavery. But at the very height of the movement, at its very peak, abolitionism had 20,000 adherents, 20,000 people. Now, when I'm talking about abolitionists, I'm talking about people who devoted their career to abolishing slavery. We're talking about they gave up their careers as teachers, as lawyers, as doctors, as businessmen to go into the abolition movement full time. Becomes a full-time job. So you're looking at 20,000 just ardent supporters of the abolition cause. And when we look at the actual numbers, you're looking at less than 1% of 1% of the United States population was actually self-described full-time 24/7 abolitionists. And so really one thing that we should, I think, come to grips with, I think we should always never doubt. We should never doubt what a small group of citizens can accomplish. One thing we learn, I think, in history, and I think when we go through the APUSH course, and as we study American history, I think one thing that is definitely that we can all come to consensus on is that change happens very slowly. Change happens very slowly. And I know in our culture today, of instant, this need for instant gratification, and for, I think we're very much a very impatient culture. It's frustrating. It's frustrating to us that things can't progress and change quickly. But owing to to our history, I think we understand that when change occurs, it occurs very slowly. And of course, this no doubt has an impact on the abolition movement. So really, there's two topics I want to address tonight. Okay, number one is going to be the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad is one of the most important activities engaged by abolitionists during the antebellum period. And the second would be the rise of violent abolitionism. Okay, the rise of violent abolitionism, and Professor Matt Clavin at the University of Houston attended a lecture where he talked about this issue of the violent tendencies of this movement, and he describes them, these radical abolitionists, as being domestic terrorists. And I think today we would label them domestic terrorists. Also, Professor Cleveland advances the theory, the idea, and there's a great deal of gravity and credence to it, is that one way that change is accelerated is violence. Like if you want change, but you're not willing to wait for it, people oftentimes resort to using violence in order to move change forward down the road, to kick the can, to get things moving down the road. And so, and many historians believe, including this one here, that what really generates reform was not so much violence, but the fear of violence. So anyway, so 1829, 1830, big year. I think in the previous presentation that I'd done, I talked about the importance of 1831 as a significant turning point in seeing Americans move away from gradualism towards, their support of the abolitionism of slavery. But in the preceding year, 1828, 1829 to 1830, there are some pretty meaningful things that take place in those years, and of course in 1831 as well. Of course, in 1830 we have the of David Walker's repeal. David Walker is a black abolitionist. He's a militant abolitionist. He's one of our note card terms. A document called Appeal to the Colored People of the World. Appeal to the Colored People of the World. And in David Walker's appeal, he calls for slave rebellion. He's the first to point out, he's one of the first black abolitionists to point out that the real enemy is not the Southern slave owner, but that the real enemy is the white Northerner who is turning a blind eye to the sinful nature of slavery. He blames blacks in the South for lack of a better phrase, for not slitting the throat of their masters. And so he was an example of an abolitionist who is bent towards violence, and that is true. And of course, another important event that really is a kind of the beginning of the abolitionism of the a sign of the beginning of abolitionism in the early 1830s is going to be the publishing of The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison in 1831. And so the fact is that he believed that not only should slavery be abolished immediately, but that African Americans be made into citizens right away, be integrated into white society, that blacks receive the same status of citizens. And that made him very radical. It made him very unpopular. In fact, there's an instance where a person will be dragged from his office and dragged in the streets of New York City, beat up. He'll be brutalized. And so at the very beginning of the abolition movement, the abolitionists were considered to be loons and nuts and crazies and just too radical for the country. And they were not very popular. In fact, many of these abolitionists will have a very difficult time. They will be often subject to violence. Okay, they'll often be subject to violence, and but he is Garrison is the icon of the movement. He's the standard bearer of the movement. He is, of course, going to be celebrated by his contemporaries. And, in his newspaper, and he had a column that was called The Bloody South. And in his column, he will cite examples of the, horrors of slavery, And so, and of course, Southern slave owners and Southern sympathizers are going to grow very despondent with the reporting of Garrison. They believe that Garrison is really not telling the truth about what slavery is really like in the South. Of course, the next big event was in 1831. The other one was Nat Turner's Rebellion. It was the level of violence was horrific. As I mentioned in the previous video, Nat Turner's Rebellion will result in the deaths of over 60 innocent people. Most of them were women and children. They were killed in their beds. These people were unarmed. And Nat Turner killed people as they slept, and he killed them with his bare hands. And the details of the revolt are very, very gruesome. So what Nat Turner's Rebellion does is it convinces whites that it's time to get rid of slavery. One of the reasons why we need to get rid of slavery is out of fear of what they see. They see slavery as a very violent institution, as a very violent institution. And later on, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, will kind of continue to build the narrative of that slavery is a very violent institution that needs to come to an end. But also the fear, what generated support for the abolition movement, was fear. And the Haitian Revolution that occurred many years before really created fear. The fact that the thinking is that the next episode, that the next big powder keg of a slave revolt would be right here in the United States and, not Haiti. So, of course, another major important event that traces the beginnings of the abolition movement is going to be the 1833 establishment of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And within 10 years, the Anti-Slavery Society had 2,000 chapters nationwide with over 250,000 people. So a very, very large membership. They published newspapers, pamphlets. They fought what we call a paper war against the slave power. And This is happening on the heels of the fact that around the same time that the Anti-Slavery Society is being formed, that slavery is being made illegal in Great Britain and all throughout its empire. And so, what the American Anti-Slavery Society will employ, they will employ the same tactics used by British abolitionists, which of course included the use of economic boycotts, propaganda, pamphleteering, types of social action. And the belief is amongst American abolitionists is that if the British can abolish slavery, then we Americans can too. We Americans can too. So, okay. So, as the movement grew, the anti-abolitionist mobs arose as well. Violence would be aimed at abolition groups. Like I said, people didn't think that slavery was necessarily the problem. People early on in the 1830s saw the abolitionists as the problem. That the reason why we have slave revolts are because of the abolitionists. And so people linked slave revolts and the violence of slavery to the activities of the slave, of the abolition movements. Okay, so that's pretty important to understand that. Let's see. So, like I said, we had abolition riots. William Lloyd Garrison, as I mentioned before, was lynched in the streets. Fruit would be thrown at abolitionists as they did their work. There's a abolitionist in Illinois who ran a printing press. 3 times had his printing press thrown in a river. His name was Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah Lovejoy. And ultimately, Elijah Lovejoy was assassinated. Now, what we learned more about Elijah Lovejoy is one of our note card terms, okay? But Elijah Lovejoy was mostly killed because of his nativism, more so than his opposition to slavery. But nonetheless, I think that the important thing to understand is that in order to be a member of this movement, in order to be a movement, a part of this movement, you're taking a great risk to your life. You're taking a great risk to your life. Now, the South, in response to the, like I said, the paper war that the Anti-Slavery Society waged against Southern planters, the South will pass laws making it illegal for abolitionist literature to be passed through the mail and through Southern mail. They also, Southern politicians were successful in seeing to it that the gag rule, also a note card term, so that the gag rule would be put in place in the U.S. Congress. The gag rule, of course, made it illegal to even bring the issue of slavery up on the floor, just to take the whole topic out of conversation. It was against Senate rules for a very long time. And of course, John Quincy Adams, former president John Quincy Adams is the only former president to actually go back into the Congress after his time as president. And when John Quincy Adams went back into the House, he his life's goal was to destroy the gag rule. He became a committed abolitionist for the rest of his political career. And so not only in the gag rule can you not even bring it up, but obviously the gag rule now makes it possible where you can't even pass any legislation to try to limit slavery or deal with the slavery. And Southerners were very resentful at a lot of the rhetoric in this paper war against slavery. They were very defensive. They grew very defensive. And in a few minutes, we will talk about the Southern defense of slavery and the arguments they used to defend slavery. Now, the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad is the second topic, of course, it was very influential. One of the effective ways, we talk about the way we're going to fight slavery is essentially, it's the whole idea. I talked about it in the last session about. Let me find that again. Oh, the stump of slavery. The stump that we're gonna fight slavery one whack at a time, and so the way we're going to measure victory in this war against slavery is helping slaves run away from their plantations. And so the Underground Railroad was an uncentralized network of people. Now, there weren't a whole lot of people that were a part of it, and the reality is that the Underground Railroad was really not very successful. I mean, in terms of it, you may get the image that the Underground Railroad assisted tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of slaves to run away into northern states and into Canada. But the reality is that not very many did escape, and it was in the low thousands. There was about a couple hundred houses. There were safe houses. Slaves would be smuggled, be moved in the cover of darkness from safe house to safe house until they reached across the Ohio River, across the Mason-Dixon line into the free states. And the ultimate goal of the Underground Railroad was ultimately, for many slaves, is to get them into Canada, or Canada is part of the British Empire. And that becomes a huge goal there. But the one thing is true. It was much larger than people think. The Underground Railroad not only smuggled people into Canada, but into Mexico and the Bahamas and different parts of the lower South. So that being said, of course, the one thing that we think of when we think of the Underground Road, we think of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is a very famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, and the Underground Railroad. You think of Harriet Tubman. She was on the front line of freedom, and she really, of all the abolitionists, she really had one of the most dangerous jobs. She was on the front line of recruiting fugitive slaves in very hostile areas. And of course, many of the runaways came from, the border states, and, I think Kentucky had the largest number. The further you were from the Ohio River, the less likely you were to run away. So the Underground Railroad was really successful in moving people away from the border states, and it was a issue of great importance to the Americans. So to the abolitionists, excuse me. So the second topic, and the last topic I'm going to address with you tonight, is the rise of violent abolitionism, and really what did the most to create the greatest amount of violence, where we really start to see the movement splinter away from nonviolence to embracing violence, is going to be the Fugitive Slave Law. Fugitive Slave Law was part of the school learning class, the Compromise of 1850, and it actually leads to abolitionists going out of their way to hide runaways in their property. And Frederick Douglass has a famous quote. He said, the only way to make the Fugitive Slave Law a dead letter is to make a half a dozen dead or more dead kidnappers. So ultimately, we will, in the Road to the Revolution unit, we will actually learn about specific examples of violent acts that were generated by the Fugitive Slave Law. The Fugitive Slave Law really is the event that does a great deal of damage into provoking a violent response from the abolitionists. from the abolitionists. So anyway, so that is going to be the end of this particular session. I will create, there will be another one that will follow, which will deal a large part describing the peculiar institution, the institution of slavery in the South, and we'll continue to dive in more to not only the abolitionist response, but also the Southern defense of slavery. So thank you for your attention.